Okay, we'll close this most basic syntax of the Getting Started section with a very brief discussion of functions. And as with variables and operators, and perhaps even more so, I'm just going to give a quick summary on the slides so that later you can pause the slides and have them up on the screen if you're trying something out as a reference, but give most of the details in the interactive example. So the parameters, the things that you pass to a function, when you declare them, you don't give the types. You use the function operator. If the function wants to give something back to the outside world, you use return. And the most surprising thing for people from other languages is that when you define a function, it's really just defining a variable whose value is a function type. This is really confusing. I'll just barely introduce it in this section, but later on we'll have a whole separate section just on functions, and we'll look at that in a lot more detail there. Okay, so a really quick example. I define the function called square. I use the function operator. I declare a parameter, but I don't give it a type. I don't say it's a whole number or it's a string or it's an array. I just say it's x. And I use return to give the value back from the function. And I can make a new variable called f and point it at the old value, and then f and square are synonyms. This is confusing, and so wait till we get to the interactive example to see that in a lot more detail. Okay, so we'll give a moderate more amount of detail very shortly in 60 seconds when we give the interactive example. But in addition to that, we'll have an extremely lot more detail when we have an entire separate section on functions. So we're just kind of introducing the basics of functions now. And I think if you just kind of copy my syntax, you can try a few things. Instead of squaring a number, you take the, half of the number, or instead of adding to the number, you subtract from the number, or you take two numbers and you add them together, and so forth. I think you can get that basic idea without knowing every last detail about how functions work in JavaScript. One of the things that people talk about a lot in other programming languages is the scope. Now, this is a little bit confusing, and it's not that important that you have a firm handle on that now. But the idea of scope is, where can a variable be seen? If you define a variable called x just at the top level of JavaScript, you just type it in, then that variable is known everywhere. This is not used very often in real life. Much more often in real life is you define a variable inside a function, either as the parameter to a function or with a separate var line inside. And then those variables are known inside the function definition, but they're not known on the outside. This is extremely common in real life. And we'll give an example very shortly of the difference and try to illustrate it interactively. But the point is, global scope variables can be seen both places, on the outside and inside a function. But function scope variables, variables that are defined in the function, are known inside the function but are not known outside. All right, let's try functions in general. Let's try this confusing idea that function definitions just define variables. And then let's look at the idea of scope. I bring up a browser. I go to either the folder containing my HTML file or the development environment containing my HTML file. I drag the HTML file onto the browser. I bring up Firebug, and I try some things out. So here's something we saw before, but we'll explain it now in a little bit more detail. Okay, so we defined a function called square, so we used the function keyword. We made up any name for the function we want, but we should choose a name that's meaningful for the operation. What does the operation do? Oh, it's squaring a number, so I call it square. And then in parentheses, I give the parameters. When someone calls this function, when someone invokes the square operation, what will they supply? If they're going to supply one number, you put a variable inside there. If they're going to supply two numbers, you put two variables inside there separated by commas. Maybe they're not going to supply any numbers. You just put parentheses with no variable name inside. And then the body of the function is enclosed in curly braces. Starts with a left curly brace, ends with a right curly brace. Eventually, most functions return a value. They don't have to. They could do a side effect, like just changing something in the page, but not returning a value to the person who called it. But usually they return a value. So you use the return statement. You can use parentheses or just spaces for the thing that you return. And statements in JavaScript end with semicolons. All right, so we've seen this before. We define the function. The return value of defining a function is undefined, but the function itself is defined. If I say square of 5, when I call this, 5 gets passed in as the value of x. And then it computes x times x. 5 times 5 is 25, and it spits it back out, returns it. So you get 25. And similarly, we saw earlier that you could say function double of a number, return x times 2. And then if I try it out, double of 5 ought to be 10. And I can have functions that take more than one number rather than a single number. So suppose I want to do some trig calculations, and I want to have a function that you pass in the length of 2 legs of a right triangle, and it computes the hypotenuse. This is the famous a squared plus b squared equals c squared function that you learned in high school or perhaps middle school. So I say function the hypotenuse. And this time I have two arguments, leg 1 and leg 2 of the right triangle. And it's going to sum the squares, and then it's going to compute the square root. Now we know how to add, we know how to square, we just multiply, but we don't know how to compute the square root. We need a math function that's built in to do that called math.sqrt. We'll visit the math functions in an upcoming section, but we'll use it right now quickly. So we'll return the square root, math.sqrt, of leg 1 times leg 1 squared, plus leg 2 times leg 2 squared, and if I remember from middle school, there was a 3, 4, 5 right triangle, so if one leg is 3 and the other leg is 4, the hypotenuse should be 5. So if I can test to see if this works, pass in 3 and 4, and sure enough, I get 5. You can also have functions that take no arguments. You just put empty parentheses. So function always same, no arguments, and I'm going to return 7. Not very interesting if it always returns 7, but it illustrates that I can have a function that takes no arguments. Usually functions of no arguments do some sort of side effect. They modify something in the page. They pop up some sort of dialog box. They don't return a value, but they can. And if I say always same, I don't pass in any arguments, so I just put empty parentheses, and I get back 7. All right, next I want to illustrate this idea that defining a function really defines a variable whose value is a function object. So let me go into the history of what I typed in Firebug, and let me go up to square. Let me just redefine it so you can see it sitting in front of you. So I've got square, and here's the interesting thing. Okay, I already know that I can do square of 10 and get 100. But I can say var result equals square parentheses 10. And that's not so surprising. Result is now 100. But here's the surprising part. If I say var f equals square, no parentheses, just a semicolon, that means make a new variable called f, whose value is the same as what the value of the square variable was. Not a call to the square function with parentheses, the square variable, no parentheses. And now f and square are the same functions. I can say f of 10, and I get back 100. Okay, that's confusing. You don't really have to understand how that works now. I just want to mention it. But later on, when we look at functional programming in JavaScript, we'll revisit this and see how this is very useful and widely used in JavaScript. Last but not least, I wanted to mention this idea of scope. Variables declared on the outside with var can be seen inside functions. Variables declared inside functions with var or as a parameter cannot be seen on the outside. So if I say var q equals 9, and then I do something dangerous, I make a function that relies on a global variable having been defined previously. Not a good idea in real life because the order that you define those matters, but let me just illustrate it. I'm going to return q plus 7. I didn't define q, and I didn't say the user is going to pass q to me. So this relies on a global variable called q having being defined previously. This strategy is not usually good in real life, but I just want to illustrate global variables can be seen inside functions, but as we'll see shortly, function variables cannot be seen on the outside. So I can define the function. I can call test1, and sure enough, it's 16. And if I reassign q equals 11, and I run test1 again, it's 18. So it sees the global variable q. But if I define a function test2, and I say that it takes an argument, and I happen to call that argument q, and I return q plus 2, and then I call test2 of 100, it returns 102, but the global variable q has not been affected. It's a separate variable, and it's still 11. And furthermore, I can find another function, test3, and it takes no arguments, no parameters, and I say var q equals 40, and then I say return q divided by 2. If I run this, test3 parentheses, it computes 20, but if I look at the global variable q on the outside, it still hasn't been changed, and it's still 11. Now, other programming languages have other scopes of variables. In particular, most programming languages have this something called lexical scope, where it's a block scope, where it's available inside curly braces but not outside the curly braces. And we'll see that there's other places besides functions where you can introduce curly braces. This idea of block scope is not something that's part of JavaScript. So if you're new to JavaScript, variables inside functions, global variables are two separate things, even if they have the same name. That makes sense. But if you come from another programming language, you might expect that a variable declared inside curly braces in, say, an if statement or a loop that we'll cover later would only be available inside that little block, that little section of curly braces, and that's not the case. All right, so basics of functions now, kind of get the idea, maybe able to define some simple functions, but you don't have to understand every last detail about functions and functional programming. We'll come back and have a whole separate section on functions later.